All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Those of you in the physical space and the virtual space. Guess I'll go get where the camera is. Okay. All right. My name is Sylvia Beverly, and I'm the chair of the NSU Libraries Earth and Sustainability Committee, and we are hosting this event. With us today is Dr. Christine Hallman, and she is going to present on developing environmental connections, a path towards stewardship. And so we're going to be turning it over to her. She's been with us almost every Earth Day season. We always bring her in. This year she was extremely proactive, and we were very grateful. She does the nature walk, which unfortunately we had to reschedule. It was for tomorrow, and we rescheduled it for April 28th. So mark the calendar there, and it'll be for 3 o'clock on that day. And she was also involved with a lot of stuff in the display. And by the way, the banner finally did go up over your students' posters. Sorry that took so long, but it is up there now. And she has worked with us on the cross sections, as well as our grounds and landscaping have been very involved this year. So we're very grateful. So I'm turning it to her now to begin her presentation. Dr. Hallman.
So my name is Dr. Christine Hallman, and I teach geography here at NSU. And I'd like to thank Sylvia Beverly and the committee for inviting me to give this talk this afternoon. And happy Earth Day, and thanks for being here. The title of my conversation this afternoon is Developing Environmental Connections, a Path Toward Stewardship. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that NSU campuses are situated on the ancestral lands of a variety of tribal nations, including but not limited to Caddo, Osage, Wichita, Kickapoo, Lakota, and Quapaw, and on the current homelands of Cherokee Nation, the United Kituwa Band, and the Muskogee Creek Nation. I also want to honor and thank the land, water, and other beings of these places, as they too have stories. And remember, I am committed to continually learning about Indigenous issues and building relationships with all beings in these lands. Now we're going to start this conversation with a very simple and yet complex question. What is nature? And it's fundamental to everything that we're going to talk about this afternoon. So what is nature? And for some, they view themselves or humanity outside of nature, while others see themselves or humanity as part of nature. And that goes to the root of how you value nature. Is it for agricultural and industry uses? Is it for recreation? In humanity's case, for survival? Is it for religious and spiritual ceremonies? Or does it have value in and of itself intrinsically? And what is nature embedded in that is how we value it. And so this afternoon, I'd like for you to start to think about, if you haven't already, how you value nature, how you see yourself interacting with nature, and start to think about your own environmental philosophy or ethics regarding nature. And the picture that you see in front of you there is Lake Itasca, I hope I'm saying that right, in Minnesota, and that's the headwaters of the Mississippi River. It's an incredibly beautiful place. It's where water, land, air, and living things all meet and interact. And if you look ever so closely, you'll see somebody you know in the middle. That's me. And contemplating, I have no idea, but reflecting and connecting with nature because I'm out amongst all those different beings. And we're going to start this conversation with some stories. So today I stand before you not as a professor or as a scientist, but hopefully as a storyteller. And we're going to talk about some lessons we've learned from some trees before we talk about how to connect with nature and how we can become stewards. And in this case, we're going to begin the conversation with Prometheus. Not this Prometheus of Greek myth, but instead this Prometheus. This Prometheus is a bristlecone pine. There are two types, Great Basin bristlecone pine and Rocky Mountain bristlecone pine. And they're found in various places, high elevation mountains in the West. And Prometheus here, we don't know exactly how he got his name, maybe some tourists, maybe locals, but he's located at high elevation on Wheeler Peak in eastern Nevada. And although his story begins millennia ago, we're going to kind of focus on the 1960s story. Now, bristlecone, you have to understand, are really unique. They attain very great ages at 4,000, 3,000 years living bristlecones. And they eke out a living in harsh conditions, very little precipitation, little to no soil for some of those ancients. And they witnessed extreme temperatures and extreme weather and wind, and all recording, what they see around them. In this case, weather and climate, or events like fires. And these bristlecones are quite unique. They are the oldest known living organism. It's an individual, non-clonal plant on planet Earth. And they've been around for thousands of years. And they have unique stories to tell. Again, Prometheus has been recording all those things. A witness. Now in steps a graduate student named Donald Curry. And he's interested in glacial deposits, specifically a glacial moraine, which is like a mound of loose material. And in this case, the glacial moraine tells the final or end extent of the glacier itself. And he hiked around Wheeler Peak and he came across this glacial moraine and he saw this unique tree. And it looked really old. And he's like, oh, this is awesome. I can sample the tree and I can find out a minimum age for this glacial deposit. So I can say something about timing of glaciers at Wheeler Peak. Now, bristlecone, when they get really old, they have unique characteristics. So the trunks tend to twist, branches twist. Maybe the original tree trunk died back and another branch took over. So they have really unique growth forms. Well, Curry, he wasn't experienced at sampling bristlecone pine. And he used what's referred to as an increment bore. And this comes in different lengths and different diameters. It's a height of simplicity for a tool developed in the late 1800s. It has a handle, and it has a spoon or extractor, which is half hollow. It has little teeth on the end. And it has a hollow drill bit that is tapered at the end with threads and a cutting edge. And when you find a tree you want to sample, you put the drill bit into the handle, and you close the latch, and you hand crank the increment bore into the tree. And when you're as far as you want to go, you take the spoon or extractor and you slide it underneath the cylinder of wood you have in the increment bore, and then you turn it backwards and it breaks the cylinder of wood off from the rest of the tree. You pull out the spoon, and on the spoon will be your core. Now, because bristlecone have a very unique growth structure, it's pretty complicated. And there are lots of versions of this story, and I want to share one of those versions. And that is that he attempted twice at least to take a sample. And the story goes, he either got the increment bore stuck, he broke it, or he just didn't get the samples that he wanted. He's trying to get the center, which is that oldest ring. So he went back down the mountain to the Forest Service and he said, can you guys help me get my sample? They said, sure. So they went back up to Wheeler Peak, and the first Forest Service worker, he's like, yeah, I'm not cutting that tree down. And another forest worker stepped up, took the chainsaw, and cut the tree down. Yeah, I'll let that sit in a minute. And so cut the tree down. Curry is like, oh, this is great. Took a sample, a section about 1.5 feet above the ground. This is important, remember that. 1.5 feet above the ground. He sanded the cross section, counted the rings, and he counted over 4,800 rings. He was happy. He had just found a minimum age of this glacial deposit. He was so excited. But when word got out, other people weren't so excited. And there was this huge push to try to find an older living bristlecone across the West, which they didn't at the time. And the University of Arizona, the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research, went up to Wheeler Peak and took a section of Prometheus, now, decapitated. And as Curry had killed the oldest living tree on planet Earth. And they took the cross section at 8 feet high, Remember, this is important, 8 feet. So they took the section back to the lab, counted the rings, and they came up with about the same number. But for a long time, this cross section sat in the archives in the trimming lab on a shelf. And just a side note, it took me years before I would actually touch this cross section. But eventually I did. But other people recently have gone back and returned to this cross section and wanted to actually cross date it. So you can count rings, but what you really want is to cross date this section. And to do that, you have to have, you're looking at patterns of narrow rings over time. So say you sample a living tree, you know that outside ring, and it has a pattern of fat and narrow rings, and then you might sample Prometheus and see where they match over time. And through this cross-dating process, they found out that the inside, the closest they could get to the inside ring at 8 feet was 2936 BC. Now they had missed all these young little rings that Prometheus had back in the day. So their estimate is Prometheus was over or around 5,100 years old when it was cut down. Now, these are important lessons for us because through Prometheus's trauma and sacrifice, hundreds of bristlecones in the West were actually protected. There were lots of people working to protect land areas, but this was fuel to the fire for protection so that they can say, we also need to protect these bristlecones. And so as a result, many have been protected in the West. This also brings up this conversation about respect. You know, do you see another organism or being on planet Earth as a being, or is it a thing to be used? Is it something to gain a number from, or is it something to interact with in some way? And so it begins these kind of ethics conversations. And these are important lessons that Prometheus taught us. Now we're going to move to Northern California and talk about a coastal redwood. And in this case, her name's Luna. She's about 200 feet tall and anywhere from 800 to 1,000 years old. Been around for hundreds of years, seen lots of things, witnessed lots of things. We're going to focus again on those humans. In the mid-1990s, there were logging companies that were clear-cutting vast sections, swaths of forest. And so they would remove everything in this area. And in the mid-1990s, they were experiencing a lot of rain in Northern California. And as a result, there was a mudslide because of that clear cut that ended up in a town called Stafford. And there were already people there that were fighting for ancient growth, old growth forests, ancient forests, Earth First, all kinds of organizations. But after this, there was a big push to try to become more active. So they would do tree sit-ins, which was illegal, trying to protect specific trees or areas of trees. And this all happened in a relatively short period of time. And enter Julia Butterfly Hill. In 1997, she kind of sat in a tree a little bit and then committed to actually sitting in Luna, 180 feet up on a platform, 4 by 6 feet for 738 days. Little did she know, she was also going to stay on that platform during the most historic El Nino on record, which means she experienced tons of rain and storms and high winds, all in that record 738 days. And she went up there to protect Luna. But in the end, Luna protected her, and as she has said many times, became a great teacher, teaching her about the environment, but also herself. And in 1999, they came to an agreement with the lumber company and purchased Luna and a 200-foot buffer around Luna for $50,000. And now she's under the protection of sanctuary forest. And she's in the middle of private land, so there's not a trail to go see Luna. But she still stands where she always grew for several hundred years. Now, for those of us who have had those moments in nature where you're completely connected in some way, it is a physical, mental, emotional, and for some of us, spiritual connection that's indescribable. And for Julia Butterfly Hill, she had many of those experiences. And so when she came down from Luna, it was extremely emotional for her. Now, afterward, people would go back and check on Luna. And in 2000, somebody came back, checked on Luna, and discovered that somebody had taken a chainsaw halfway through Luna. So they quickly tried to get everything together to stabilize the trunk. We're talking about, 200 feet of tree. And that's what you see in the image on the left. And so they stabilized. They managed to stabilize the trunk, and Luna still survives today. It's great lessons of resistance, not just resistance against the elements like storms and rain and weather events, but it's resistance actually against humanity, in that Luna stands against all that push for so-called progress and against so many things, despite not having a human voice. That also leads to another important lesson from Luna, and that's resilience. Despite all odds, she still exists on the landscape today. And with these two lessons, it kind of moves back and we reflect on ourselves about resistance and resilience in our own lives. Then we're going to move a little bit further north into British Columbia. Now, in this case, we're not going to talk about individual trees. We're going to talk about a forest system. And we're going to talk about Douglas fir and paper birch, and a professor named Dr. Suzanne Simard, who's been studying these forest systems in the area for over 3 decades. Now, building on prior knowledge from other researchers and other knowledge keepers, specifically indigenous knowledge keepers in the area, also her family has a long history as foresters in that area. And so she began to really look at the forest, not just the trees, but how everything is connected in the soil. She starts to think about what are called mycorrhizal fungal networks. And basically it's a bunch of fun guys in here with mycelium, which are little root-like things, and they connect, in this case, trees to trees. So she's like, how does this work? Do trees communicate with each other? Do they not? Do they share things with each other? So she began lots of lab and field experiments. And what she discovered was trees in this forest system shared carbon, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, and water. They were sharing nutrients with each other through this fungal network. She also discovered that the old big trees were pretty key in the fact that they would share nutrients, excess nutrients, with other seedlings and saplings and other trees in this forest system. And then she's like, well, do they share with other species? Is it with everybody? And so she studied if they gave nutrients to paper birch, the Doug firs, or to just Doug firs. And what she found is they share nutrients and water with everybody, but a little more with those baby Douglas firs as their kin. She also came to realize that they would communicate stress signals like, dude, it's really dry and droughty around here. I think we need to reallocate our water use. And they would communicate that through that fungal network. Also, when they look around, they're like, hey, there's some larvae and they're chewing on my needles. I'm a little stressed. We need to do something about it. So they send these defense enzymes through the network to communicate that with other trees. This seems like so crazy. Like, Doc, are you talking about Avatar? Is this for real? Yes, it's for real. In fact, she's written like 100 to 200 scientific articles about this. You can check them out yourself. And then what was interesting is that when these large, she calls them hub trees or mother trees, when they die, they release vast amounts of carbon through the whole network, sharing that carbon that they stored for years with everybody else in the forest. And this kind of reinforces this idea of interspecies cooperation. Now, way back in the Stone Age, when I went to school, when I learned about evolution and ecology, it was like everybody's got to outcompete everybody else. Well, that's not necessarily solely the case. There is competition, but there's also cooperation. And with this cooperation in the forest system, it increases resiliency of the forest. Now, what you see there, that's circles and lines, that's where they've mapped, I think it's 1 or 2 species of fungi in that network and their connections with trees. The largest, darkest circles are those mother, or I call them elder trees. And then there's lots of different sizes, diameters. Now, the ones that are most connected are those older trees. but they're connected to everybody. Even there's tiny little dots toward the top that are seedlings connected to those. And it just shows you and reinforces this idea of interspecies and intraspecies cooperation. And the lessons here are one of community. Now, in English, community means like group of people with some kind of shared characteristics. What I'm talking about is actually a Cherokee concept called Gadugi, which means kinship, relation to other, how we treat and care for each other, it's family. And this is an excellent example of how forests, through this mycelium, are actually caring for each other. And then there's the importance of elders. Without these elders to share this excess nutrients and water, then the forest would look completely different. And this brings us to the idea of reciprocity, which means sharing, right? Sharing, in this case, nutrients and water with each other. Now, this is a very brief description of all of Dr. Samar's work. I'd encourage you to check out her kick butt YouTube videos, which are very awesome. And so those are the three kind of lessons we're going to talk about today. Now that leads us to how do we develop these relationships or connections with nature so we can learn these lessons and so much more, so we can reflect on ourselves. How do we begin to do that? And of course, there's tons of ways to do that. I don't have time. We're only going to talk about 4. The first one, and the most important thing, is you need to unplug. Not right now, wait till the talk's over. But unplug from this thing and everything else and go outside. You cannot expect to have any kind of relationship with anything, anybody, any tree, unless you go outside and spend time with it. Now, this might take lots of different forms. You might go out in groups or individuals, or you might be serious, hikers, or you might just be goofing around. It might be a lot of different forms, but the key thing is to go outside. So the top left picture there, that's me and a buddy. We're taking a break and doing some field work in giant sequoia, aka we're just goofing around. And then that bottom one on the left, that's me being very contemplative. I have no idea what I'm thinking in that moment, but it looks very meditative. And then the one in the middle there, I tell my students, everybody needs like 5 or 6 happy places because it gets so stressed in life. You just got to mentally go somewhere. And in that case, that's one of mine. It's in Kings Canyon, giant sequoia. It's a nice meadow. Smell the pine, hear the water, feel the rocks, and the sun and the wind, and you just right away feel so much better. Now, it might also take many forms, like you go to some grandiose place like Kings Canyon, giant sequoia, which is what you see in the bottom right, or it's me at the top on the edge of Tucson. Right? More than 500,000 people. That's also when I had red hair. So it would take any kind of experience, as long as you go outside. There are studies that say going out in nature reduces your stress level. It reduces your heart rate. It makes you breathe deeper. It increases your attention span. It increases your empathy and creativity. These are all scientific reports. There are disciplines called ecotherapy and ecopsychology. You should check them out. All sorts of things, but you just got to go outside. Next, when you go outside, bring your observation skills and your sense of curiosity. You have all this time, you should be focused. What's happening in this moment? And to do that, you start to ask questions like, why are those trees blown down? Why are these trees planted in a row? Why are those injuries on that tree? Why is that weird growth there? Why does the skink not have a tail? Are you serious that snake can actually eat that frog? These are really important questions, right? This sense of curiosity. And that leads to awe, right? Awe, you're impressed. And this all leads to inspiration. And inspiration leads to further interactions with nature. And that leads to attachment to a place. Place matters. Everything happens someplace. And this attachment has an opportunity to grow. Now, this attachment can take lots of forms. One is through research. Now, our default might be, we're talking about like quantitative and qualitative research, but there's also indigenous research, which takes a holistic approach to studying something. And you might have students up there taking samples of tree rings, students collecting water quality data. I'm up there in my grandma's hat collecting growing season data, looking at, watching the slowest tree grow on Earth. Yeah, okay. Taking measurements, there's nothing like that. Students mapping the city park here in town so they can make improvements in the area. And then that's me in the bottom there doing some research on how to build an ash basket from scratch, literally from scratch. And so research takes lots of forms. And one of my favorite quotes is, if research doesn't change you as a person, you haven't done it right. And that's from Sean Wilson's book, Research is Ceremony. And it's so true. If it doesn't change how you look at something, your perspective, or even your own identity, then you're not doing research right. And all of that leads back to community. And what I mean here is, you can go and experience nature and be with nature and belong to nature as an individual, but sometimes you just got to do that in groups. This could happen in lots of different ways. Like if I can do something in the class, then we go outside and do it. So that tested some water quality data outside of those four walls. A lot of times you see lots of great conversations and questions, there's laughter, and that usually doesn't happen when students are encased in those four walls. You can also go on field trips like the water treatment plant, where they can ask all kinds of experts, questions like, where's that water come from? How is that filtered? Why did you add that? All these great questions are bringing that curiosity and awe. Then there's also collecting tree ring samples, staining the creek for critters, because critters tell you stories about water quality. And then that picture in the middle, that's in Minnesota, basically where you're in a place, you get to know the people and the culture, and you get a new perspective on how culture and place all interact with each other. That's really transformative. And those are really unique and valuable experiences. Now, this is my transition slide. And my transition slide is side. I'm on nobody's side because nobody's on my side, little orc. Nobody cares for the woods anymore. And of course, this is a quote by Treebeard from the Lord of the Rings movies and the books written by J.R. Tolkien. Now, the key thing here is Treebeard says, nobody cares for the woods anymore. And sometimes we feel isolated or overwhelmed about some of these environmental problems that we face, but we have to realize that we're not alone. There's always somebody there, right? Right now, it's not a whole lot of us in the room, but hey, there's a lot of you out there virtually. We're never alone. That leads us to this question. Why is it so important that humans see themselves as parts of nature? Now, this returns to that first question, what is nature? Now you see that's my son Max, and he's checking out the rocks, probably saying, hey, how did these rocks get here? Why are these this color? Why are they this size? All sorts of questions. The one in the middle there, he's jumped in leaves. He's probably saying, hey, this smells weird. Why is this way? Why do trees lose their leaves? What lives in here? He's bringing that curiosity and sense of awe. And then what does that do? That promotes attachment to a place. And what does that do in turn? It creates a sense of care or love for a place. And so you want to do something to improve that place, to make positive change. And you see right there, Max is picked up trash. Now that leads us to this idea of stewardship, right? Stewardship. What does this mean, stewardship? In a lot of ways, it means caring for a place, protecting a place, advocating for a place. And oftentimes we think about these grandiose places like Grand Tetons National Park, which is what you see at the top. Or it could be a creek that flows out of the Nickel Preserve just north of Tahlequah. But it also could be your backyard. Well, in this case, that's my front yard at the top. You think about your yard, what do you put on your yard? Pesticides, fertilizers, what do you remove from your yard? What do you add to your yard? And so all that is a part of caring for a place. But probably for me and my identity, what's rooted in my sense of stewardship is actually how I grew up. I am a simple farm girl from Kentucky, and that's my daddy in the middle there, holding Max in one arm and a tobacco plant in another. And he's a small farm owner, and we have all kinds of conversations. And I asked my dad, so how do you view the environment or land? And how's that different from like large agribusiness? And my daddy simply said, I know the land. I've walked every inch of it. And what he means is he's spent time with it. He knows that how the land rises and falls, how it drains, where the water pools, where the sinkholes are, which is important in South Central Kentucky. And then he knows where the trees, what trees are where the rocks are. He knows that place. And when you grow up farming, you're physically touching the earth, right? Picking weeds, planting stuff, watching it grow and die, cycles of life and death. And you get this physical connection, but also mental and emotional, and for some of us, a spiritual connection to place. And that leads me to that last picture in that bottom corner. That's also in Minnesota, where you start to have conversations with people about problems, environmental problems, solutions, where do we move forward, how do you connect to a place, and these important conversations all form this basis for stewardship. Now, how can we actually be stewards, protectors, guardians, advocates for nature, right? And it's a big question. And I guess what I do is I start with role models. So I have a few on this slide. Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, wrote about pesticides in the 1960s and their impacts. Winola LaDuke, as we're moving clockwise, I think. Winola LaDuke, incredible advocate for water, for food sovereignty, for manoomin or wild rice. She's an Anishinaabe from Minnesota. She's written lots of books. One is Recovering the Sacred, which is really good. There's Berta Caceres Flores, indigenous Honduran, which fought against the construction of a dam on a sacred river in Honduras, which they led protests and all sorts of stuff. The dam didn't get built, but ultimately Berta gave her life for her environmental causes, in this case, water. Then there's Autumn Peltier and her great aunt, grandmother Josephine Van Damen. Her grandma, great aunt, she walked with a copper pail around all 5 Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway, praying for the water and educating people about the water. And her great niece, Autumn Peltier, which you see there in Anishinaabe from First Nations of Canada, picked up right where she left off as a water protector today. Then there's Jane Goodall, studying chimps in East Africa. Little would we know, she taught us a lot about humanity. And she's involved in lots of different things, including Roots and Shoots, which is a program for kids. And then one of my personal favorite sheroes of all time, also known as the Tree Lady, is Wangari Maathai. As the first East African woman to earn a PhD in veterinary science and biology, returned to Kenya, saw Kenya in stress as they had massive deforestation of huge swaths of land and a lot of soil erosion. So she didn't sit by, she did something. She created a nonprofit called the Green Belt Movement, where they pay women to grow from seed trees and then plant them. And in Kenya, they've planted over 50 million trees. Not only helping the environment, but also empowering women to take control and make decisions of their own lives. So these are just a handful of role models. Then you can also check out some other, kind of doing your research, hopefully outside under a tree or next to the river. There's Henry David Thoreau, Aldo Leopold, and John Muir. They're usually classics on environmental thought. If you're feeling a little mixing it up here, talk about the 1960s with James Lovelock and his idea of Gaia, which was kind of revolutionary, especially at the time, where he suggested that the earth was a system of systems that self-regulated, almost like an organism in and of itself. And then feeding on that was Stephen Harding, his idea of the animate earth, animate versus inanimate, living versus non-living. And then Lynn Margolis, which makes some really cool discoveries. And in her book, Symbiotic Planet, they all three kind of have lots of conversations, and there's lots of those on YouTube you should check out. And there's Sylvia Earle, ocean advocate extraordinaire, excellent TED Talks, by the way. Then there's the book Hidden Trees by Peter Wallenau, and he kind of synthesizes a lot of different scientific research on trees and brings it to one place, including like how trees adjust during drought years with improved water use efficiency, how trees make noises in the woods when somebody's there to hear it, all kinds of interesting concepts. And then there's Bell Hooks, fellow Kentuckian. She's a feminist, and she's written tons of books, but the one that kind of really spoke to me for this talk was Belonging, A Culture of Place. And she really talks about how the importance of place and culture and identity. And she has some really interesting conversations about tobacco and how tobacco was treated pre-contact and how tobacco became a commodity or cash crop later and what was done to it physically for that to happen. So those are kind of interesting conversations. to start to think about your own environmental ethics. Along with that is Gregory Pueblo, written several books. These are the two that kind of fit here, but he's written lots. My favorite is Native Science, and it's a really interesting take on seeing science. Science is just a search for how things work and how to view that holistically as opposed to looking at parts and then putting the parts back together, which has its value, but looking at it through an indigenous lens holistically, where you see how everything's connected and related, is really eye-opening for a non-native person like myself. Now you can also plug in and get right involved. You can join the Nature Conservancy. There's the National Groundwater Association. There is the Coalition of Conservation of Oklahoma, and there's many more that you can get involved in. There's also places where you can actually collect data that will help research and scientists. One of those is CocoRa's. It's Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network, where I think the last time I checked, you can buy a $35 rain gauge, put it in your yard, and then monitor precipitation, and then put that into their database online. And then that helps meteorologists verify their models and all sorts of cool stuff. And then there's the USA National Phenology Network. Phenology is just recurring growing season events like buds opening, leaves changing colors, hummingbirds showing up, bird migration. And so you can collect this data and put that into their database, and then all kinds of scientists can use it to research and forecast allergies, seasons, spring warm-up, climate change, all kinds of stuff about growing seasons. If you're interested in getting involved in the Phenology Network, let me know. I got something cooking, keep it on the down low right now. But if you're interested, let me know. Now here in Eastern Oklahoma, we might want to focus in a little bit closer to home. And a lot of these organizations have to do with water. One is Blue Thumb organization. They collect water samples and focus on water quality in specific streams in Eastern Oklahoma. There's the Green Country Guardians. They're again focused on water quality, specifically related to agriculture, especially mega poultry farms. And then the Watershed Sanctuary is focused on education K-12. And then there's Save the Illinois River, a nonprofit focused on anything and everything that has to do with water in the Illinois River Basin, from quantity to quality to advocating for water. These organizations give water a human voice to advocate for positive change. And that leads us, hopefully, to where we began, with that question about what is nature. Getting to the root of that is how you value nature, how you value your surroundings or the environment. And this is fundamental. Do you see yourself as separate, right, from nature? Do you see yourself above nature? Or do you see yourself within the Earth's web of systems and cycles of cycles? And how you view yourself is how you really construct the value system. This value system is extremely important because what that does is it helps you form relationships and connections to place. As we said earlier, place matters. And creating this attachment to place creates care and love, and you want to do something. So unless you have those feelings and that kind of attachment, and you value the environment, not for what we can gain, but how we can be a part of the whole system, is really fundamental. So I'd like to leave you with the idea, or maybe the question, on what are your environmental ethics and how do you fit with nature? And I'd like to say thank you to everybody out there, virtually and in person. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some cool nature pictures and to talk about trees and to be here to have these conversations. So thanks for watching.